After the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy was unorganized and in need of a smart, reliable, and strategic admiral to lead them to victory against the Japanese in the battle for the Pacific. Chester William Nimitz was the perfect man for the job because his early life and college experiences, along with his demonstration of leadership and his brilliant tactics during World War II, helped drive the Japanese out of the Pacific Ocean and ultimately allowed the United States to win the war against the Japanese. Chester Nimitz was born on February 24, 1885, in a town called Fredericksburg in the center of Texas.
Chester was very close to his grandfather as a child, most likely because he was more of a father figure to Chester than a stepfather. He and his grandfather went on countless hunting and fishing trips in the country, and it was his grandfather who urged him to retaliate against the kids that found him at school. While attending high school at Tivy High School, some lieutenants from West Point stopped by the school. Inspired by these men and realizing he had little to no future in Texas, he took the entrance exams and applied to West Point. He was turned down, but Congressman James Sladen offered him an open slot at Annapolis Naval Academy. He accepted, quit high school, and enrolled in 1901.
Throughout Nimitz's early life, he demonstrated his ability to step up and lead on many occasions. At college, Chester was recognized as one who, as his school newspaper put it, possesses that calm and steady-going Dutch way that gets at the bottom of things. He assumed the responsibility of making sure he and his classmates worked hard in their classes and got good grades. When it came to grades, Chester was very competitive with his roommate Albert Church. This competition between them helped drive both Chester and Church to the top of their class. Every day, Nimitz would wake up at 4:30 in the morning to study and help tutor his fellow classmates. Nimitz was not only an intellectual in college, he was also on the varsity rowing team. He was the 8th man in the boat, meaning he was the one that set the crew's rate and rhythm. This experience would help him learn how to deal with a crew.
When Nimitz was 22 years old, he was given command of the destroyer Decatur. It was very uncommon for someone that young to assume command of a destroyer. When he was given command of the ship, it was in terrible condition and was to be at Olongapo, 60 miles away, within 48 hours. It was lacking vital equipment, provisions, water, and fuel. However, he showed his capability to lead by organizing a group to help him get barge loads of material onto the ship. After working day and night, Nimitz had successfully loaded all the water, fuel, and provisions he needed. He successfully made the Decatur operational and ready to sail. After he was relieved of his duties on the Decatur, he was given various assignments on submarines up until the outbreak of the Second World War. In December of 1941, Nimitz was promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific area. He was awarded the responsibilities of Commander-in-Chief because President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized Chester's qualifications and potential. The first time Nimitz had been approached for this position, he refused and said that he lacked the seniority. The second time Chester was given the opportunity, he took the position and relieved Admiral Kimmel, even though he knew he still lacked the seniority. Roosevelt selected Nimitz to be the Commander-in-Chief because he knew that Nimitz would be able to make the necessary orders to lead the Navy to victory. He was also aware that Nimitz was able to connect with whomever he worked with and capable of raising the morale of his fellow officers.
He was picked over more senior admirals to do his job, to be Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Forces, but I think with him in that job for those amount of years, it was clear that they made the right choice because he was the right man for the job of winning the war in the Pacific.
After months of naval conflict between the U.S. and Japanese, it all came down to one deciding factor. The Battle of Midway was that factor, and was one of the most impressive and important naval battles of the Second World War. As Nimitz himself put it, it was the battle that made everything possible. The American side of the battle was prepared to face the Japanese entirely because of Nimitz's trustworthiness. Nimitz was fairly certain that the Japanese would be attacking the Midway Atoll for a few main reasons. First, he knew the Japanese were going to cross the Pacific, and they would never pass up the opportunity to capture an outpost, especially one as useful as Midway. Also, his team of codebreakers, led by Commander Rochefort, had intercepted and broken Japanese codes. They were often wrong, but Nimitz had trust in his men and decided to use the information they had collected to advance on the Japanese.
We had broken the Japanese code, and we were their daily communication. We had, unfettered access to their daily communication. So they were handing Nimitz essentially the Japanese playbook for Midway.
The Japanese had sent out a long string of top-secret code which contained all their plans for the upcoming attack on Midway. While Nimitz was now convinced that they had the Japanese battle plans, not all of his officers were sure. On May 1st, he personally made a trip out to Midway to inspect each gun pit, command bunker, and defense. He asked the Marines stationed there what they would need to ensure a successful defense and made sure that they got what they needed. He returned to Pearl Harbor on May 3rd. Nimitz then came up with a brilliant plan to show the officers that his codebreakers were right.
He made a very courageous decision to commit the entire U.S. fleet to set the trap on the Japanese that proved to be successful. So if he was wrong, he would have cost the entire U.S. carrier fleet on the West Coast would have been sunk. But he, again, had the courage to make a tough decision and committed his aircraft carriers, our aircraft carriers, to battle.
He had his radio operators send out a message in clear English that stated Midway was out of fresh drinking water. The Japanese took the bait, and the U.S. intercepted another message that AF, the presumed codename for Midway, had run out of water. This was the message that Nimitz needed to convince his officers that he was correct about their planned attack.
He, again, trusted his subordinates, trusted the intelligence folks that the intelligence they had gathered was accurate, and again committed the carrier fleet to set the trap. And as his decision would have it, he was right.
The United States was now ready for battle. Although the Japanese greatly outnumbered the U.S. in ships, the United States had a few major advantages. Admiral Isuroku Yamamoto of the Japanese Navy had a very complex and intricate plan that exploited a three-prong attack method. Nimitz's, on the other hand, was much simpler and focused mainly on sinking carriers. Also, while Yamamoto was stationed on the largest carrier of the Japanese fleet, Nimitz had the tactical advantage of controlling his fleet from safety in Pearl Harbor. After the day was over and the damages had been tallied, the Japanese Navy had lost 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, 1 damaged battleship, 1 damaged oiler, 3 damaged destroyers, 322 aircraft destroyed, and about 2,500 men lost. Meanwhile, the American side had lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 142 aircraft, 307 men, and extensive damage dealt to Midway.
As a result of his tactics and smart decisions, the U.S. gave Japan its first naval defeat since 1863. Filled with pride from this victory, the Navy was fully inspired to win battles against the Japanese. Now in control of the Pacific, the Navy advanced towards Japan. For the first time during the war, Japan was on the defensive. On August 6, 1945, 3 years after the Battle of Midway, atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nimitz was aghast at the bombing because, as he points out, the Japanese had, in fact, already sued for peace before the atomic age was announced to the world with the destruction of Hiroshima and before the Russian entry into the war.
Following the dropping of the atomic bombs, the Japanese formally surrendered. On September 2, 1945, in Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri, Nimitz signed the Japanese surrender document that marked the end of a costly war. At the end of his career, Chester Nimitz was one of the most decorated admirals in the U.S. Navy. This was well deserved, as Nimitz shifted the momentum of the war with his ingenious plan at Midway. Nimitz was not only a great tactician, but also an incredible leader. He was able to execute plans precisely and knew when to give necessary orders. As a result of the positive influence he had in the Navy, one of the only nuclear-powered ships in the U.S. Navy was commemorated after him, the USS Nimitz.